Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hey, hello again. Welcome back. Good to be with you on our Church in Action podcast. We believe that when the people of God are known for love and unity and doing good works for our communities and society, it's evangelistic. That's what Jesus talks about in John 17 and Matthew 5. But it requires disciples, people who are willing to live like Jesus, disadvantaging ourselves to serve and love other people. So on our podcast, we talk about issues of God and culture. So as disciples, we can better love and serve others, do good works. In other words, what the Bible talks about is justice, opening doors to share Jesus, which accelerates evangelism and we believe will transform our world. Today, we have our guest with us, a special guest. He's on this episode, becomes our most recurring guest star. We were just joking beforehand. We have Dr. Emmett G. Price III of Gordon Conwell with us. Dr. Price is the professor of worship, church, and culture at Gordon Conwell. He's also the executive director of the Institute for the Study of the Black Christian Experience there, but he does a whole bunch of things. He's the founding pastor at Community of Love Christian Fellowship in Boston. He's a weekly contributor on WGBH Public Radio. He's the executive producer and co-host of All Revved Up, a competitor podcast to us. I hope we're not fishing for the same audience there.
No competition, brother. No competition.
And he's a trustee of the Boston Landmark Art Orchestra, director of the boards of Metro West YMCA, as well as the Robert Weber Institute for Worship Studies. He was the honorary chaplain of the Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement. And as I said, our most frequent guest star, with all the rights and privileges that accord to that role. Thanks for coming back, Emmett. We do appreciate it.
Hey, Charles, thanks for having me again. It's so wonderful to be with you and so wonderful to be with those who are watching and viewing today.
Thanks. Yeah, I know, just for our audience, I know some folks will say to me, we're talking about race too much. And we average about once a month. We try and talk about race once a month because it is such a big cultural issue for us. And there is a huge opportunity for the church to step into that and be different than the world. Of course, others will say, hey, you need to be talking about a lot more. And some will say, hey, why have you waited so long to talk about it? Right. So there's a lot of different dynamics in this. And I hear this from people I would consider to be honest, decent believers. And I'll share just my equation, which is simple. Whatever we think about, how much we talk about it, the causes of it, the solutions up to it, the agendas that might be out there, it isn't going away. It's broken. And it's not going to get better until the church experiences racial reconciliation and shows the world what that looks like, and that Jesus can overcome our history and the issues we're facing today. The world can't solve this. The question is, can the church? And if we allow Jesus to, we can. Right. The question.
Yeah, I'm glad you framed it that way. I often say that part of the healing process is to be able to talk about what you could not talk about before. So there are still many of us who are still at a very infant or primary stage of healing. Since we don't want to engage in that topic, we don't want to engage in that trauma or be triggered by it. And then there are those of us who have moved past that and are willing to get our arms and our feet and our legs, kind of muddy in this very complicated and challenging conversation. But it shows that we are healing as people as we're able to engage and not be afraid of the conversation.
That's a great point. Thank you. And so we do want to have honest dialogue here between believers who, and Em and I always hope that there's going to be some disagreement.
Yeah,
because we ought to. Otherwise, it's not going to be a very interesting conversation. But we also ought to be able to show that we can at least disagree in Christian love that bridges our divides. We don't have a list that Emmett and I have ticked and tied to make sure we agree on this or disagree on that. But my own view, and I think I don't want to put words in Emmett's mouth, is I don't care. Because I respect Emmett for who he is, not just because he's so generous with his time and his intellect and his experience, but because he's a brother in Christ. Amen. And I just enjoy our conversations. Amen. And so and if we can't talk in Christian love, we've got really big problems. If we're going to yell at each other and cancel each other and ignore each other, we're no different than the world. And if we're just going to have happy talk, we're no different than the world, and we're not going to make any progress. So today we're going to continue a dialogue we did last month. Emmett was nice enough to come back again. I told him it was 1 episode. Now it's 2. I won't be surprised if it needs to be more. Really talking about some of the dialogue around race, because the more I've tried to engage in this, I find that I think we use words different ways in different conversations. And those are words that there's evolution of meaning, it seems. It's not always the dictionary definition. And we end up talking past each other, I think, as a result of that sometimes. So we went last time, and we'll do it again. We want to deal with a list of words. Racism is one, systemic racism is another, equity, white supremacy, privilege, and critical race theory. We made it through 2 last time, and we're going to come back to those 2, unfortunately. I remember when we first started going to a Bible study at our last church, it was a year and a half into a 6-week study on Romans. And we started out that day in like Romans 9, and we finished in Romans 4. And I said to the teacher, I think I know your problem here, and I'm going to be guilty of the same thing. And so let's go back to the conversation of racism. So last time we talked, we just went to the dictionary and said, racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. And I think we agreed that was a good working definition.
Correct.
But as we talked, Emmett, it sounded to me like you attached the word power to it. Did I hear you right in that?
That's correct. Power is the differential.
And so can you expand on that a little more? How do you think about power in the context of what that means then?
Right. So, what's interesting is that in the notion of racism, there's a grounding of a baseline that becomes the normative perspective or the normative culture or the normative system of beliefs or activities or whatnot. So anyone who is part of that grouping, that race, are baseline. Anybody who's not part of that grouping are either deficient or they're superior, right? But the power dynamic does not allow anyone else to be superior to those who are the baseline. So then everyone else is inferior. So whoever controls the baseline, whoever controls the narrative, whoever is the normative has the power to redefine, to reassign, and redelegate anything and everything else.
And so when you talk about baseline, what's an example of what the baseline is today?
Sure. Baseline, and most generic baseline, is if you have 2 individuals who do a foot race, and in the event that there is no tie, one person wins and one person loses. And most often the winner gets to define the narrative. The winner is the one who gets to substantiate how they won and tell that story of how many steps they took and how graceful they glided and how they looked over their shoulder and saw the person who didn't win in their hindsight. But when you think about power dynamic, when you think about race, let's take the Civil War, or what is also called down south, the War of Northern Aggression, okay? The loser of the war gets to define the terms of the war, right? So even the very notion that down south in the history books, that it's called the War of Northern Aggression, okay, is a definition, a description of their perception or perspective of the war. And the fact that even though the Confederate lost the war, we're still in the 21st century fighting over Confederate memorials and monuments and whatnot that were erected after the war. So if you go back and see the foot race, the winner inherently has the power to articulate and narrate the race. But when you're dealing with racism or any of the isms, it's not necessarily the winner, it's whoever operates from the normative position.
And so I'm going to trust you on the foot race one, because I have never run a foot race and there is little risk I ever will. So what I hear you saying, I think, is the baseline is the concept of a group who defines what is accepted wisdom in our context.
Accepted wisdom, accepted praxis, accepted beliefs, normative behavior, social norms, emotional norms, all across the board.
So I have heard, we've got a lot of Southern friends over the years, and I have heard one talk about the war of Northern aggression, and she was just being anti-North at the time.
Sure.
and so, but in a fun way, right? She wasn't being serious. But is there something? So to in my experience, that's a more historical thing, and is not as prevalent today in where we are in New England. Would you have another example?
Sure. I mean, let me give you a national example, actually an international example. May 25th, 2020, Derek Chauvin, a police officer, Minneapolis, had his knee on the neck of George Floyd for what we thought at the time was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Now we know that it was actually closer to 9 minutes and some seconds. And now we have the trial. And now watch this. The trial is correctly named the Derek Chauvin trial, but most people call it the George Floyd trial. And if you watch the prosecution in their opening statement, they had to deal with the fact that by national consciousness, that George Floyd, even though he was the one who is dead and is no longer here, is still on trial because folks have to still exonerate him in a nation where you're presumed innocent until you're proven guilty. Now, he's not even a defendant. This is how race plays in this nation, particularly now I'm using the justice system, right?
So, yeah, I haven't heard how people talk about the trial. I read on the trial every day, but I haven't heard people referring to it one way or the other. So I trust you. But is it fair though to conflate defense attorney? And this wasn't intended to be our focus of our call. We may park on it a little bit though. Is the practice or the approach of the defense attorneys in trying to shift the blame, which is what every defense attorney does, right? Is that fair then to say that's the overriding narrative? Because that's what I thought I understood you to be saying.
Yeah, I mean, so check this out. So if you take kindergartners, you take the most global kindergarten classroom ever, and you show them the video, and I pray that we don't do this, but with kindergarten logic is what I'm trying to get at. They will say that person number 2 hurt person number 1. It's not okay, and I'm sad about it. Okay, kindergarten logic. Now, to me, that's actually more biblical than what we got going on here, where person number 2 clearly did something that cost person number 1 their life, but all of a sudden it's about person number 1. Well, whether he was a drug addict, whether he actually had a counterfeit $20 bill, whether he refused to listen to the police officers. We go down a laundry list of things that will actually reset the whole normative sense that person number 2 perhaps had the right to do what he did to person number 1, right? And that's part of the normalization of what we see and what we sense. So the conversation is not about this guy did something absolutely wrong. The conversation is about, well, why did he do it?
But is that though? Because it sounds to me like different things. I think the conversation in the country that I hear, at least, is we're appalled by what we saw happen. The video said it all, and I wouldn't argue this as a fair trial method, but the video said all we needed to know. And it's just the only one making this argument, I think, is the defense attorney. and that's their job, rightly or wrongly, right? That's our system, is they get to make a defense. And so I don't hear that as the narrative. Do you hear other people saying, hey, look, it was okay because, maybe he passed a 20, maybe he resisted? Do you hear that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the only reason that the trial is like the number one watched thing right now is because the American consciousness is wondering, will justice prevail, where it has not in so many other cases. I mean, this case is being watched the same way that the O.J. Simpson case was watched, right? They stopped everything and the case of the 4 officers who were accused of beating up Rodney King. You've not had any other legal cases this right? And because if it was just a normal case, we would have never heard about it. It would just be another, right? But the eyeballs on this are because something that seems so obvious may not have an obvious outcome. Yeah. And the challenge of that is because the notion of normative and normalcy and what happens in this country for centuries in terms of a lack of justice, a lack of equality, and a lack of seeing Black people as equals.
And so if we try to tie this back to the power question, because I'm still trying to grapple with it. Mm-hmm. If we're trying to tie it back to the power thing, the fact that we're questioning whether justice will be done relates to then power. How? I'm sorry, I'm struggling.
The person who is sitting in the normative seat has the power. So even though Derek Chauvin's on trial, Derek Chauvin has the power. It's his trial to lose. You see what I mean? It's George Floyd, the dead man, who has to prove that what we saw in a video actually happened. Like, that's power. I mean, everyone saw it.
So, but by that criteria, every defendant has the power, because you always have to, the defendant has to be proved guilty. They're assumed innocent.
Yeah, I mean, you can go that way.
Okay.
But if this was a case of a white person and a white person, what I'm saying is you would have never heard about it. Like, that's an everyday scenario, right? But when you have a white police officer and a Black body on the ground who's deceased, that we got to figure out, I mean, the power is clearly in, whether it's Derek Chauvin, whether it's police officers, and the whole notion of how we have qualified immunity within this country, right? The power dynamic does not play out equally. And I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make here.
And so I'm trying to figure out then how, because it sounds almost like power can be situational.
Power can always be situational, but let's go back to the Bible. I mean, in many ways, you have the early Christians, many of them were Jews, mm-hmm. right? They were Jewish converts. And one of the biggest things that Paul is writing about in the New Testament, in the whole series of letters, which we get very clear language in Galatians, is that, all of you are children of God. Even those of you who are Jewish, who in the Old Testament were the chosen ones. Well, in the New Testament, by the grace of God and by the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ, you're all equal, right? Neither Jew nor Gentile. But unfortunately, the Jews felt that they were chosen and had more rights and had more power, had more access, had more proximity, had more intimacy to the divine, such that the Gentiles, which essentially in this terminology means other than Jewish, right? So even the way that we codify Gentiles, right, is based on Jews being the norm, right, being the ones in power because they get to define everybody else. But the Gentiles
are not anymore.
Well, I mean, not anymore. Yeah. But I'm showing you how this operates, within a system where we see and sense that something is not par. And even if we can't put our finger on it, hindsight is a gift. We can look back and see exactly what's going on. There was a power dynamic between the Jewish Christians and the Gentilian Christians.
Okay. And so then the power dynamic clearly changes over time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And changes from culture to culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And situational even.
Absolutely.
And so if we go back, and if I remember how this power dynamic came up last time, I was asking the question of, can a Black person be a racist?
Mm-hmm.
I think what I heard you say is no, because they don't have power. Am I remembering right? Or
I'm saying no. But black people have power. We absolutely have power. The way that it plays out in this nation is different. Back to your situational piece, right? So I grew up in Los Angeles, California. We in the inner city neighborhood that I grew up, we were socialized in essence to not like, and in Christian terminology, to not love, brotherly, sisterly, sibling love, Koreans and Mexicans. Okay, 30 years ago, I think 3 weeks ago was the murder of Latasha Harlins, right? A young African American girl who was shot dead in a Korean grocery store because they suggested that she was stealing, and she got shot in the back. Those type of incendiary situations create all kinds of emotions that go all over the place. So as young people, we were literally socialized to not show brotherly, sisterly affection, the same way that many Southern white Christians were socialized not to have brotherly, sisterly, sibling love to Black people, particularly those who were their slaves, right? So there's a power dynamic even within the church. Now, I'm not trying to equate, though, slave owner to slave and Black person to Korean or Mexican. But the difference is that as a person of color operating from a racist tendency to another person of color, the pain and the trauma of that is horrific, as we're seeing now with the continuation of persecution, oppression, and trauma against Asian American, and Pacific Islanders right now, being perpetuated by a whole lot of people, right? But there's a difference between what you just said as situational, which will be me onto somebody else, versus the entire justice system that perpetuates that same kind of disparity, right? And so that's how the power dynamic works. And I think you said it best, that you can have historic, you can have systemic, you can have situational. So I'm not going to suggest that my inability to love a person, another person who has a different ethnic origin than I do, that it doesn't hurt and that it's not impactful. Absolutely, it hurts, and it's impactful because we as human beings, we have power. We God has given us power and authority, but individual power is totally different than systemic power.
And is it the systemic piece that goes back to this narrative that you were talking about, or do those operate a little bit separately?
No, absolutely. So the war of northern aggression is a systemic thing, right? The justice system is a systemic thing, right?
Yeah. The more I delve into that Reconstruction period, it becomes clear that there's a sense in which the North won the war, and there's a sense in which the North lost the war.
Yeah.
It just took 10 more years to lose.
Yeah. Isn't that something?
Right. Because everything got put back in place. Once Reconstruction was over, everything got put back in place with some different names and different mechanisms and not as much clarity around it, but it got put pretty much back in place, with exceptions, but
and
pretty
this
much
is
back in place.
and this is the point about race, Charles, that the phenomenal, courageous white folk who fought on the side of the Union against the Confederacy, that it took them 10 years to essentially still be converted by Confederate ideology. That's a race thing. Because what that says is that even the courageous white folks who were fighting against slavery, who were fighting against, the subordination and the oppression of fellow human beings, that it took them that 10 years to actually see that there was still power at play, and that if they wanted to retain power, then inherently they would have to fall prey to insubordinating somebody, so that they're not being insubordinated themselves.
So now, are you talking about poor white Southerners, for example, in that, or are you talking about white Northerners?
I'm talking about anybody who was complicit in Jim and Jane Crow.
Gotcha.
So I don't care if they're poor or not poor. Whoever was complicit in holding a system that was clearly set up to subordinate people by their ethnicity or their race. I'm talking about anybody who was part of that.
Well, there's a sense in which we're all part of it, right? Because it's our society and we live in it. And so there's a sense in which God looks at nations and judges nations, even if you personally didn't do it. So there's a sense, I would argue, that everybody's involved in all of our sins as a nation. Am I fair in saying that?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you define everybody.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not sure you're going to blame the people who are being oppressed, right? So, but again, the fact that you can say everybody is a perception that the everybody that you're talking about are the ones in power.
And so, but now I want to separate it out.
Yep.
Because I would say that, well, there's a whole bunch of different things going on in that.
Yeah.
You have clearly people who would have argued at the time, look, Black people are inferior, and this is and so we're going to do this, or it's purely about economics, and we may put some sheen on it, but right, we need cheap labor for the model to work.
Yeah.
Then you would have people who, I don't like this, hate it, put whatever adjective you want against it or verb, but I don't know how to change it. And then you have the people who maybe are fighting it, some of whom got killed for fighting it.
Yeah, many of them did.
And I one estimate was, and so tons of lynchings going on at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like, about, as best I can find the data, 2/3 of them are Black people who are being lynched. 1/3
Mm-hmm.
is white people who are being lynched.
That's correct.
So people on all sides are paying a price. So if you so then you go in. So let me paint this scenario, because this is what I think about. So, and try and translate into where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
Is okay. You want to stand up for whatever is right in this situation. Stand up for it. We're going to kill you,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not going to change anything. What do you do?
Well, you figure out what side do you believe God is on.
Mm-hmm.
And if God is on their side, then you're actually willing to be killed for it, right? I mean, the choice is where the power is. For those folks to choose to be silent because they didn't want to lose their life shows that they had power to make a choice, because the people who were being lynched didn't have no power, right? And I tell you who else didn't have power in this scenario is the indigenous, who continue to be left out. So you see the hierarchy of what's here. And so anyone who has the privilege, let's use this word here, to make a decision as to whether they want to get involved or not, is operating with a sense of power because they have a choice.
So let me probe on that for a second, because there were, I think you said it on our last podcast, but no, actually it was Dr. Ray Hammond on one of our other podcasts, that the truth is that while the church was at the forefront of the civil rights fight, churches, majority of churches, black and white, were not.
Yeah,
Would you agree with that?
It depends on how you define the church, because I would say actually the church in mass was not on the forefront. I would say that there were a number of churches, majority black, some white, who were on the forefront, but not all black churches was on the forefront of the civil rights. I mean, that's the whole scandal about Dr. King being kicked out of the the Baptist Minister Association because he was young and he was pushing, he was trying to move. And in that time, the old folks were like, yo, man, just cool out, we'll get there. And so King and Abernathy and Young and many of them founded the Progressive Baptist Association, which was still Black Baptist Association, that tended to be of a younger generation because they were willing to push in ways that some of the older folks, and God bless them, they had been on the battlefield for a long time and they just had different ways of going about it. There were certain white churches and white denominations that were on the front line, Quakers. I mean, there's all kinds of folks who were on the front line. So it wasn't just easily white and black. But the point is that the church in mass, the Church of Jesus Christ of the United States of America, was not part of the civil rights movement. White evangelicals inherently, Billy Graham, not a part of the civil rights movement. I mean, we have to draw some definition in terms of that complex picture there.
And so, yeah, it's a question about at what point does believers be involved talk about the church being involved versus, right? And I don't know how God thinks about that. So right. Answer that.
Right.
But I think it's a fair point. So black and white churches involved, most black and white churches not involved. And so, but then everybody's making a choice to be involved or not involved. So doesn't that mean they all have power?
Yeah, I mean, black people inherently were involved. They just may not have been involved in the civil rights movement, right? Because you still had the Black Panthers on one side, you still had Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement on another side. So it's not to say that black people in mass, and then you had some of the more kind of more conservative leaning black folks, particularly those of means, who had different ways of going about it, right? So there's not just one way to go about it. So I wouldn't say that many black churches were not involved in what I would call the freedom movement, the liberation movement. And I'm not talking about liberation theology. I'm talking about the freeing of black people from the oppressive forces of supremacist ideology. I think all black churches in some way, shape, or form, by the fact that they didn't have the privilege, right? Even those that thought they had economic privilege, we have statistics and stats to show now that black folks, no matter how much money you make, right? I mean, here in Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, you remember a couple of years ago, Dr. Henry Louis Gates was going into his home and was arrested, going into his own home, right? So here's a phenomenal scholar and a person of great means who is still seen and perceived as less than because of the color of his skin.
Mm-hmm. And I don't remember the details of that case. I vaguely remember it, but can you just refresh my memory on it?
He was going into his own home, and a neighbor who, I don't know how in the world they misunderstood him for, a interloper or intruder, called the police because there was a strange black person entering this home. I think he was fidgeting, looking for his keys. Police come out, weapons drawn, and then you have this kind of standoff. Right, with one of the most famous black people in the nation. Like, how do you do that, right? But you do, and that shows power dynamic. That an anonymous person can weaponize the civil servants, right, without cause, right, to come on this man's own property.
And so how do you solve that, though? Because when I hear that, I'm like, look, I get it. That's wrong. And I wouldn't want that to happen to me. I wouldn't want it to happen to you. I wouldn't want it to happen to anybody. But if the police get a call that somebody's breaking into a house, it's not necessarily unreasonable for them to go there and be ready for something bad to happen and react that way, is it?
I think it is.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever seen Skip Gates. I mean, in many ways, he walks with a cane.
Yeah. He's
he's certainly not threatening. at least physically. Now
I think he's over 80, isn't he? Or he's at
I
least
don't think he's that old. I think he's in his early 70s.
Yeah.
But you know, physically not intimidating. Intellectually, there's a whole nother thing, right? But again, this whole notion that a Black person is a threat is a construct of racism, right? Because racism gets to define who the threats are, right? So Charles, if I, and I'm not going to ask you this, but I'm just going to make an overly sensational stereotype. Charles, if I ask you who in a phenotype would be the most threatening type of person that would make you cringe, you may give me an answer, right? My answer, Charles, is a police officer, right? And that's partly because of post-traumatic stress and because of various examples and experiences that I've had. But you can bring the most, you know, horrific looking, you know, person who has a hijab on and who people may phenotype as whatever they would phenotype them. I'm not afraid of that person. Mm. But the police officer in the uniform, yeah, my body will react to that before my mind thinks about, well, maybe they're not coming for me, right? And that's a product of how this power dynamic works.
And so what would you say to the person, and I think I might be getting off the power dynamic a little bit, but maybe I'm not, because I'm still grappling with it. What would you say to the person who would say, but Emmett, the odds of an African-American person being killed by a white police officer are lower than a white person being killed by a Black police officer or a Black person being killed by a Black person? Because I suspect there's something different in that than the data reflects. And so,
I mean, as a human being, those statistics mean nothing to me when I've seen what I've seen in my life. You see what I mean? So the example that you shared, at least the second example, is not what's floating around on our cell phones when we see social media feeds of these, you know, horrific acts, right? But again, I'm from the inner city of Los Angeles. So I can list names and experiences where people who I loved and who were dear to me are no longer here. Those are real things. So in that sense, statistics absolutely mean nothing to me because I have real life experience, real life trauma, and real life experience. And perhaps my experiences may be to someone else seen as exceptions, right? But again, I don't get to see my experiences as exceptions in my real lived experience.
And my assumption is, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I don't think you'd let me if I tried.
You know me too well, buddy.
But my assumption is also that if those real life experiences also have been reinforced through history,
yeah, there you go.
Where the police specifically, if we go back to the civil rights days, where it's very clear the police were very much part of, now I don't want to tar every police person, but every police office, but there were police departments being used to enforce oppression.
Yeah,
right? And kill people, and we're very much part of the Klan, and right, and that's only now continuing to play out in our personal experiences. It's a little bit hard to get away from that. Just look at data.
I mean, that goes all the way back to slavery, right? The original police were slave catchers, right? I mean, going back to the 13th Amendment. So you're absolutely right there, and you did something that I want to illuminate right now. I'm not trying to suggest that all police people are bad. I'm not trying to suggest that all civil servants are corrupt. I'm certainly not. And it may sound that way because we've moved from Derek Chauvin to talking about Los Angeles Police Department to talking about. So let me place that caveat that there are some phenomenal police officers who are absolutely altruistic and you know, just wonderful people, and many of whom are believers too, and wrestle with how to navigate and negotiate their faith even as they wear that uniform.
And I'm glad you said that, because I'd like to piggyback on it if I can, because somebody did after one of our podcasts or something say something about, what about defund the police? And we Christians can react a little bit ungraciously sometimes, and so let's set that to the side for a moment. But my reaction to that was, When I talk to African-American pastors in my network,
Mhm.
I don't hear any who think we should defund the police. I think they'll say there's some reforms that are needed,
Mhm.
but we need the police. Uh, is that?
Yeah, I bet. So here's my take. Um, I think the church, if we were operating from a sense of strength and being fully involved in the social and economic needs of the people, all people, not just our neighborhoods, then I think we'd have a different conversation. But the church has pulled back from stepping into some of these spaces. Many of the people within the Black Lives Matter movement are people from the church, but the church as a whole has not participated in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the church has been absent. Now, clearly, local churches have participated, but the church as a whole has been absent. And so that leaves the narrative to be dictated and defined by folks that are outside of the church. And so we're left to respond to nomenclature that I think has been proven not to be helpful. Defund the police, the concept, I think is an important concept for us to consider. The articulation and the rhetoric of that is not helpful, right? So I think in an ideal situation, let me be an absolute divine optimist. In an ideal situation, we would scrap what we have now and reconfigure it, recreate it, and readjust it so it doesn't become a series of band-aids to what was inherently created as a racist system to contain, to oppress and to traumatize Black people, which is what the slave catchers were and the early formations of the police. And over time, we have been bandaging that up. We've been band-aiding it up. We've been trying to fix it. So if we did something like Homeland Security, which in my understanding did not exist before 9/11, it's a totally new entity that was created as a result of, this international threat to our nation. And the point is that in moments when we know that we need to do something drastic for the safety of all people, we do it. And so defund the police is not helpful as a slogan, as a nomenclature, as a term. But I think the concept behind it is to reconfigure, reestablish, and recreate a new system that works on behalf of everybody rather than trying to patch it up.
Well, I'm going to show my cynicism. I kind of vacillate between being cockeyed optimist and cynic. and when I was watching the DHS formation, I reacted a little bit differently. I said, okay, so we've got an existential threat to the country. Our response is to redraw the org charts for Washington, right? Because we just took a bunch of agencies and put it. Now, in fairness, there's some better communication, presumably, that was intended as part of that. But it's like, okay, let's reorganize the deck chairs.
Yeah.
And so we're not good humans, I think, and our society. We're not good at big changes, partly because we're not good at change, right? We're change resistant. But there's also the change brings unexpected consequences, and sometimes they can be worse than where we are today. And so big change is hard, I think.
I think so, but I also think that we have a difficulty with change because we don't know each other enough. So the people who get to dictate and determine the change are the ones who are doing it in their best interest and their assumed best interest for everybody else without necessarily knowing what those things are. So sometimes we re-inscribe perceptions rather than actually inviting perspective so that we can actually change our own assumptions or presumptions.
And so when you say the people who are dictating or driving the change or lack of change, who is that? Because I don't think a lot of us, at least in the church world today, would feel like that's us. Because nobody seems to care what we have to say. Now, some of that may be the way we're doing stuff, but who is that? Is that our elected officials then?
Yeah, I mean, it is our elected officials, it's people in high authority and high places. But I mean, the thing is that those people go to church too. So if we as a church feel like no one's consulting us, then that means that we don't know the people in our own pews, because most electeds, do the round robin and come to your church to get your votes. So you have access and proximity to them, and particularly when you invite them to come in and give their stump speeches. And then all of the elected folks on Easter Sunday morning, they in somebody's church, or at least, with a selfie showing who they're watching online, right? I mean, during COVID, but they're part of the church, and to separate them out, I think, does a disservice. And I think that that's the challenge of the church. We try to flip people out who we don't want to associate when it's appropriate, but then when we need them, then we want to embrace them in. Well, we need to be consistent with that.
I think we may have hit on a cultural difference here, because in my church experience, politicians do not come to the church, and that doesn't mean they don't go to church, but they do not come visiting church at white churches. We do not invite them to do that. We don't get stump speeches from them. There is a cultural difference, I think, that happens there. The only time I can ever think of it happening in my old church was because we had a pastor from the UK where something from the government was more accepted. And so we had somebody retiring, and we had a certificate from our state senator or something like that. And most people were shocked because that was such an unusual thing, and it rubbed the wrong way. And so there's a cultural difference there. So I don't know that politicians pursue white churches the way I've seen them pursue African-American churches, or majority of African.
Well, let's test the concept.
Go ahead.
Have we ever had an atheist president in this nation that you know of? Let's just say within the last 50 years. Let's do it that way.
Somebody who is honestly atheist, no.
Well, see, now here we go.
That way, I don't know, but all would profess some level of faith, right?
Yeah. And so even the most recent, former president, if he made a suggestion that he was such and such and he was not, how come the pastors didn't come out then and say, nah, that's not true, right? So the point is that even he, President Trump, was a part of somebody's fellowship, part of somebody's church, right? And all of the Supreme Court justices in my just off the top of my head are believers. Matter of fact, there's 6 of them, if I'm not mistaken, who are actually Catholic, right? Right? So the point that I'm making is that so culturally, perhaps now, if they don't venture into white churches, perhaps that is a cultural difference, but it also shows a interesting point about power, that Black folks are a block to be leveraged during voting season, even if they're not important any other time. And we can look at Georgia to see how that's playing out right now. So the point is that if there is a system at play where faith is either an active agent or inactive agent, then I think the church folks need to come out and say that, because there are too many politicians who are going around, and on Christmas they're in somebody's church, on Easter they're in somebody's church, and on Mother's Day they're in somebody's church, and those folks are taking the photos, and we're all excited that such and such showed up in our church, and we're not actually being honest if you're suggesting to me that they may not be a faith.
Well, I think I can't judge anybody's heart. I know you wouldn't judge anybody's heart or anything like that, but we know everybody professing to be Christian is not really a believer. And there's a lot of cultural Christianity in some parts of the country. There's less here in the Northeast, because it doesn't buy you a lot to be a Christian in the Northeast in terms of the world's terms, right?
Yeah.
And so, but it's still, as your point is, as I think fair, it's still a voting block to go after.
Yeah.
And so some of that, I assume, is maybe it's not cultural Christianity I subscribe to, but electoral Christianity.
Yeah, and see, and that whole stratification may be another cultural thing, because on the Black side of town, I don't think we do that. So I don't think we're leveraging who's a practicing versus who's a cultural, and who's a 3 times a year versus who's a 52, 54 time a year. I don't believe that we do that on our side of town. So that may be a cultural difference there.
And so and I know I've had some, well, I'm just looking at the time, so let's try and work ourselves towards the close anyway. And so one of the things I remember a pastor saying one time, and he was talking to a pastor, it's a white pastor talking to an African-American pastor friend in Boston. Mm-hmm. And they were somehow they got onto this topic. And the takeaway from it was the African-American pastor said, his church expects him to be involved in politics. They expect him to know the mayor. They expect him to know the city council. They expect him to know all the players. And the kind of clarifying point was that the white pastor was saying, wow, my church doesn't expect that and actually would have a problem if I did.
Yeah, I mean, that, to me, that analogy is very important to show how different, and I'm not going to suggest this is a power dynamic. I mean, I probably could do a reading on it, but I'm not going to suggest, but it shows how different we are and how much we don't know about each other. Mm-hmm. Because the fact that as a Black pastor, I need to have proximity to not only the mayor, but the chief of police in my area, and the chief of fire in my area, and the district attorney in my area, and the U.S. attorney, right? And my congressional and senatorial representatives, as well as my state legislature representatives, because I may be the person who can facilitate and mediate on behalf of my congregation in ways where white congregants can do that for themselves. Mm-hmm. So they don't need a pastor. They just need a pastor to pray. I mean, whatever that difference. But my point is that if the church is going to stand up, it needs to stand up for all the church, and not just to base what it does on the norms of a white church, which talks, preaches, and teaches that we should not be political. By the very nature of my Black body, I'm 6 feet tall. I'm 200 pounds, by the fact that I show up in the room, particularly of all white men, my presence is political because somebody's in the room saying, what is he doing here? How did he get in here? And who invited him?
Yeah, I think I am hearing some white pastors who are starting to say, or have been saying, in fairness, that we probably need to acknowledge or be political, but separating that from being partisan.
Oh, yeah, man.
And I don't think, even when we know our first selectmen and stuff like that, at least my church experience, we're not talking to them about policy and stuff like that. We're trying to be respectful, love, care for, right? Witness. But there's a piece of this, I suspect. I was hearing your point about, hey, part of it is, hey, you guys may not have to, right? Whereas a Black pastor may need to be that advocate for someone in his church. But there's also a piece of it, I think, that there's more I don't know if this is a proper term, electoral diversity in white suburban churches than there are in Black urban churches. And what I mean by that is there's a sense I have that, and I'd be happy to be disabused of it if I'm wrong, but there's a sense I have in that a Black pastor is safer doing that because his congregation is more uniform in who they vote for than the white pastor. You don't think that's true?
No, that's not true. We just, as Black people, we know how to disagree without being disagreeable. I mean, so if you take the assumption is that all Black people are Democrats. Well, most Black people who are part of the military are actually Republicans, right? So, and then many Black people of means are actually independent, right? So the universal thought that Black people are Democrats by nature is the same also general thought that Black people inherently are liberal in theology. And I tell you that most Black people are some of the most Bible reading and literal reading people on the planet. So the whole challenge of that is, let me push this back in your way, that on my side of town, we see that most, particularly white evangelicals, are taught that the Republican Party is the Christian party. And if you believe in Christ, then you're a Republican, right? And so we're saying, well, how can Republican Party be the Christian party when the policies, generically speaking, are often anti-people of color. So again, there's a power dynamic, because if the Republican Party is a Christian party, then that must mean that Christ don't like us, because the way that the policies go down. Not being overly sensational, of course, but
yeah, and because certainly people of good intent on both sides would agree and disagree with what you just said in terms of the policies.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that might be an interesting conversation to have at some point. Where I was really going at is that at least when I'm in Black church context, it's 85%, right? And that's what the data shows, 85, 95% are voting for a Democrat. Are you saying that you would say, but in the church world, that's probably not reflective of how believers vote who are African?
No, I'm saying that how people vote versus what they're registered as are two different things.
Yeah.
Even if I'm a registered Republican, and if a Republican candidate comes out and he or she is saying some racist stuff, come on, Charles. I'm gonna vote against my own party because I'm still a Black man.
Yeah.
Right. So how people register versus how they vote, we don't necessarily always go with party first, right? Because we don't have that privilege.
And so this is fascinating. I've enjoyed it. I think this was a harder conversation. So I appreciate you. I don't know if you felt it the same way, but it's a little trickier to navigate. So I really appreciate you being patient and helping me.
I just love talking with you, man. This is great.
Thank you. Same here. And so now we didn't make it through our list. We did kind of wander off over here a little bit, but that's my fault, not yours. But it's been really helpful and a blessing to me to talk about this. And I think a really constructive conversation, because I can't imagine I'm the only person trying to grapple with this, and that you're the only person grappling with, right? So I appreciate you taking time again. And it's these areas that if we, the church, can really engage in it and have the relationship to have these kinds of conversations. And before we close, I do want to make one point. I don't believe that the Democratic Party is the Christian party, and I don't believe the Republican Party is the Christian party, and I know you don't either. So I
That's right.
Get that on the table.
Amen.
I think there's one Christian party, and I know he's not on my side. I'm called to be on his side.
Amen.
And so you can tell I've heard a sermon or two. And but thank you again, Emmett, for being with us. I hope you'll come back again and we can continue our dialogue. I'd like to thank our audience. I hope that you're grappling with this too, because if the church, just think about what the implications would be if the church was fully united, loved each other, had no racial issues, and valued and loved each other because we are made in the image of God. Imagine the witness to the world. People would have to say something is different about Jesus, and that would be transformational. So pray with me, please, about what we personally can do to bring reconciliation and to engage and to have the kinds of relations we really need to. So Emmett, thanks again. God bless you. I'd like to thank Bob Atherton, who's our producer. Our next podcast will be April 15th, and we're going to have the Reverend Dr. Clive Calver, who is an old friend of Vision New England. He was Youth for Christ in the UK, Evangelical Alliance in the UK, and that's a theological term in the UK, not a political term, just to be clear about that. He was also a pastor in New England at Walnut Hill Community Church in Connecticut for 12 years. So he's got a pretty unique vantage point on some of the issues around us and evangelism and our culture and stuff like that. So we'll be getting his thinking on it. So look forward to talking to him. Emmett, thanks again. God bless you. See you all next time.
Thank you for joining the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about Vision New England and what God is doing in our region, check out our website at visionnewengland.org. We hope you'll join us next time for the Church in Action podcast.